back on the campus here and to see what you've done with it. It's been great meeting a number of the undergraduates who I had a chance to meet over the past couple of hours. As you've now heard, because Sandy has told you, I grew up hearing a lot about Goucher along the way. I was glad that you mentioned what class Mom was a member of, because if I had let the date out, I think there was some concern about whether or not I'd get sort of a hot meal when I was coming back home. We heard a tremendous amount about Goucher. It was terrific. I'm sure I would have applied, I'm sure my dad would have applied, had there not been a bit of gender discrimination on the way at the time. But it's wonderful to see what an incredible, vibrant student body we have here now. When Sandy called a number of months ago and honored me by asking me to come give the Arch lecture today, we thought the big subject would be WikiLeaks, which we had just published, and something I was deeply involved in, or maybe the budget negotiations or the debt or whatever. We had missed, and this conversation was, I guess, late last year, sort of the two big events of early 2011. And I refer first, of course, to the fact that the Orioles are in first place. Painful as that is for a Red Sox fan. And secondly, that there would be a modest uprising on the other side of the world, one that would shake our perceptions of how the next few years may play out. And it would certainly shake half a century of American certitudes and a good number of platitudes about the Arab world. We still don't know whether the events we've seen over the past couple of months will ultimately be for good or ill. But it's certainly been pretty interesting times in the news business where I toil and where Sandy spent so much of his time before he came over to the other side here. A few Sundays ago, I was sitting in a news meeting, one of those weeks when we were working around the clock, and I was listening in over the speakerphone to our daily Page One meeting, and I heard some editor in New York, some disembodied voice say, so let's see, we've got a civil war underway in Libya, we have an American intervention that's about to happen, we have rioting in the streets of Syria, we've just thrown our closest ally in Yemen under the bus. There's an earthquake, tsunami, and nuclear meltdown in Japan. And then in the back of the room, I hear some other voice said, yeah, but anything for the front page. So I want to reserve most of this evening for the conversation with Sandy and then with all of you. But I just wanted to throw out a few simplistic impressions about the past few months and what we're calling the Arab Spring. I think the words alone give you a sense of how much we are imposing an American construct on this, because as an Arab friend pointed out to me quite sarcastically the other day, you know, we don't have spring. And in fact, they don't. And then I thought I'd talk a little bit about our other big journalistic adventure, WikiLeaks, and why we published it and what we learned from it. But first, the Arab Spring or Arab Winter or beginning of Arab Summer, whatever we're calling it. A caution about this subject matter. We have to come to it with some humility, since absolutely none of us, certainly not me, had predicted that these Arab uprisings would happen this year. And in fact, I don't really know anybody who did predict the timing of this. And you have to think about that every time you flip on the TV and you hear some expert opining quite eloquently about what's going to happen next in this. If nobody saw it coming, our ability to predict the next few months, I think, we have to approach with some caution. We have a lot of company, by the way, in not seeing it coming. One of my favorite tales from the reporting of this session, remarkable couple of months, where I've been mostly focused on how the White House has responded, is that President Obama, in one of his morning intelligence briefings, asked his CIA briefer during the midst of the Tunisia uprisings, so what are the chances this is going to spread to Egypt? He said, oh, sir, under 20%. So I thought that was pretty bad, and I went to some Israeli officials who I know pretty well, and over dinner I said, okay, guys, so what was the Mossad's prediction about what would happen coming out of Tunisia and spread to Egypt? They said, under 20%. So we all sit here wondering why we can't figure out whether the Iranians are really trying to build a nuclear weapon. I think you now know the answer. But on to a few quick points. Obviously, this is potentially a vast change, as broad in its implications as 1989 was in Eastern Europe during the time period after the fall of the Berlin Wall. In many ways, a lot riskier, because these are many societies whose past habits have not been as unified nations. All 22 Arab countries are in play in some way or another. No one knows how this drama will play out. If the conventional wisdom just 2 months ago was that Egypt was on the cusp of long-delayed, pent-up desires for democracy, I think that the conventional wisdom today, only 60 days later, is, as one dissident in Egypt put it so wonderfully about a week or two ago on our pages, the dictator is gone, but not the dictatorship. You have now seen the rise of the military. You saw the other day what I thought was a really bad sign. A blogger who was sentenced to 3 years in jail, basically for contending that the military hadn't changed much since Mubarak left power. So how do we think the Obama administration handled this? I think it's fair to say that the Obama administration played the first act of this change pretty smoothly. But it's clearly running into problems now. And we probably are in only the first or second act of what may be a 5-act play or more. True, the reaction initially when the uprising started in Egypt were a little bit bumpy. There was that moment when Secretary of State Clinton was asked whether or not she still sided with the government in Egypt. This was in the early days of the protests. And her answer was, well, Egypt is a stable country, and Mubarak is interested in reform. A week later, no American official would utter those words to us a second time. The day after she said that, Vice President Biden was asked whether he would characterize Mr. Mubarak, obviously a long-time American ally, as a dictator. And he wouldn't answer the question. A week later, everybody in the administration was saying that he had been a dictator for 30 years. But they recovered from this pretty fast, and President Obama had some pretty tough calls with President Mubarak, urging him to enact reforms, or at a minimum, get out of the way of the reforms, which was his polite way of saying to step aside. At one point, the president said to President Mubarak, you know, I respect my elders. You've been in power for a long time. Obviously, he'd been in power since the time that President Obama actually was in college. But the reaction that President Obama heard from President Mubarak really stunned him. At one point, Mubarak said to the president, give me 10 days, and this will all go away. President Nasser went through this. He survived it and told me how to survive it. Well, that isn't what happened, obviously. And President Obama pulled the plug on a very loyal American ally. Now, he did this in part because he concluded, actively, I think, that the Egyptian military was not only unwilling to fire on the protesters, but was unwilling to bet on an 82-year-old dictator who had a vague plan to turn the government over to his son, whom the Egyptian military itself deeply distrusted. And so President Obama made, I think, a very cold, calculated conclusion that President Mubarak had been a source of stability and was now a source of instability. And he lasted less than a week after that moment came. But Egypt was a rarity in what was coming next, because as we now see, Egypt was a place where American values, which is to say, supporting democratic rule and what the president calls universal values, matched up fairly easily with American interests. Yes, we had had an interest in a stable Egypt, but once it became clear that Mubarak was the symbol of instability, our interest shifted very rapidly to taking a bet that either democracy would rise up, or that the military, which the U.S. was very comfortable with, having trained them over many years, would take over. And that's still the bet that they're making. But when you think about what's happened elsewhere in the region, that neat matchup of values and interests suddenly disappears. And that explains, in many ways, how it is that we could have been vocally on the side of the Egyptian protesters, that we are silent about the protesters in Bahrain, or nearly silent. How we've said almost nothing about what the Saudis need to do with this stuff. And why in Yemen, the United States supported a longtime dictator who has been a center of American counterterrorism strategy for many, many years, until 2 weeks ago they came to the same conclusion they came to about Mubarak, which is it would be a more unstable place with him than without him, and they threw him under the bus too. Now, in the case of President Saleh of Yemen, there happened to be no bus coming along. It's Yemen, you know, the bus system never works. And he's still holding on. So that takes us on to Libya. And this fascinating question of why it is that the U.S. got involved in the Libyan operation, in trying to force Gaddafi out, and why it is that the United States pulled back from this operation so quickly. And here, I think the interesting moment came on the afternoon of March 15th. Hard to imagine it, not even a month ago, this happened, when all the president's advisors gathered in the White House situation. And a couple of interesting things happened. The first is that everybody in the room was haunted by a different memory of something that had gone wrong at some previous time in their careers. So you had Susan Rice, who was the American ambassador to the United Nations, and Samantha Power, who wrote a fabulous Pulitzer Prize-winning book called The Problem from Hell, which dealt with the Rwanda issue and had been around for that, and Secretary Clinton, who remembered from the time when her husband was president, the American failure to go into Rwanda and its slowness in going in to stop the great tragedies in Bosnia and Serbia. And they all ganged up on the side of the U.S. has to invoke this responsibility to protect, a phrase that is often used at the United Nations about the responsibility of the international community to protect people who are threatened by their own leaders, versus a very realpolitik group within the administration that says, look, we have no vital interest in Libya. None. It's not a huge oil supplier. It's not a particularly strategic position. Unlike Bahrain, there's no American base there. Unlike Saudi Arabia, it's not a long-time ally. It's not central to containing Iran, the way Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, even Yemen, many of the Gulf countries are. So why would we possibly get American troops involved in a place where we have no vital interests? And this was the debate that took place for much of the afternoon. The president ended up splitting the baby. He ended up saying, we have to go in, but we're not going to put in any ground troops, and we're not going to take the lead for very long. We're going to do this for a few days and turn it over to NATO. As if that's turning it over to someone else. We are about half NATO, but we'll set that aside for the moment. And so you saw the result. The U.S. went in starting on March 19th, led many of the airstrikes, turned them over a little more than a week later to NATO, and what's happened ever since has been a complete stalemate. So that raises the question, did the president act correctly and cautiously, or did he worry more about getting out than getting the job done? And here it's a difficult question because you have heard two very different goals being laid out by the United States and its allies about what it is we're trying to accomplish in Libya. The president said before the American air operation began that it was time for Gaddafi to leave Libya. The United Nations only authorized the military action to protect the population. When you ask American officials, what are we doing? They're saying, well, the military operation is only aimed at protecting the population. All the rest of the pressure we're putting on Gaddafi is to get him out. Now, this is a pretty complex construct, especially because you have a lot of officials around the world, including French and British and others, who are saying, no, this can't be successful without Gaddafi out. And I think it's a strategic muddle a bit that has left the U.S. at something of a stalemate, not only in Libya, but in Washington, trying to understand what the political objective is, and then how much military or non-military force they're willing to commit to that. There's one other element I just wanted to throw out for all of you to think about as you consider how this plays out over the next few months and maybe over the next few years. If you ask anybody in the Obama administration through, say, January 15th, what is the major objective of American policy in the Middle East? Their answer would have been, it's simple. It's to keep Iran from obtaining a nuclear capability. At the moment that Iran gets a nuclear weapon, all politics in the Middle East change. The chances of an Israeli strike on Iran would rise dramatically. The chances that Iran would use its power or its supposed power to spread its influence in the region would also change the politics of the Middle East and maybe the world, and could, of course, trigger a nuclear arms race in the region. My guess is that within a few months, the U.S. will return to making that its major objective. But it's a difficult calculation right now for several reasons. Gaddafi, until the U.S. joined this attack, had been held up as the model for the rest of the region. After all, here's a man who had renounced terrorism, whether he believed it or not, he renounced it, and turned over his nuclear weapons program in 2003 to the United States and the international nuclear inspectors. And in return, he got diplomatic recognition, he was taken off the terrorist list, there was trade underway, and now the U.S. has turned and, of course, joined this effort to oust him. If you are sitting in Tehran right now, and you are watching this set of events play out, what lessons do you extract from it? Well, I'm no expert in guessing the minds of the mullahs in Tehran, but I think it's a pretty good guess that the lesson you would emerge from is exactly the lesson that the North Koreans said they emerged from this, which is build your nuclear weapon as fast as you can. Because in the end, they believe that had Gaddafi actually been successful, and he was a long way from being successful, in building a nuclear weapon, the French, the British, and the U.S. would have thought twice before mounting those airstrikes. And they're probably right about that. There's a second lesson, and it's early to draw big lessons from this, that I think is worth considering. And that's this. We have all enjoyed the sight of social media playing a huge role in gathering these protests together. I mean, could you put a flash mob together in Egypt or in Bahrain or in Tunisia if you didn't have Facebook. And we'll spend years trying to figure out the role that social media plays in this. But it's also clear now, a few weeks into this, that social media is also a huge weapon for the forces of repression. I mean, imagine this. You're an intelligence officer in Bahrain, or you're a military officer trying to put down protests in Egypt. And you need to figure out who a dissident is likely to call to the square so that you can round them up before they get to the square. Facebook is your great friend under those circumstances. If you can get inside Facebook, you can put together the network of opposition as quickly as the people who have been using Facebook can put together a protest. And we've seen this happening with ferocity in China ever since the first days of the Arab uprisings. The Chinese have not messed around in rounding people up and stopping protests. And we're beginning to see the same thing happen throughout the Middle East. So one thing to consider as we think about what the long-term effects of this is going to be is that the social media has been very much a double-edged sword. One last quick point, and then I'm going to sit down and start up this conversation with Sandy and with all of you. It's about WikiLeaks. It was a fascinating project to work on. I guess I first saw the big WikiLeaks database of all of the State Department tables in August or September of last year. And it gave us what we now know is an image almost sort of preserved in amber of the U.S. perceptions of the Arab world and the Arab world's perceptions of us just prior to this fascinating uprising. And we saw all the dynamics back and forth. We saw American officials who were pressing Arab leaders to reform, but not willing to press them too hard. We saw Arab leaders who were intently worried about Iran to the point that the King of Saudi Arabia urges his American counterparts to cut off the head of the snake. It was a fascinating look inside the day-to-day operations of American diplomacy. And by and large, we learned that American diplomats were doing pretty much what American diplomats said they were doing. The publication of WikiLeaks was highly controversial in many parts of the country. And I have just a couple of points to quickly tick off about that, and then we can pick this subject up if you want to when we go on with the rest of the conversation. The first is this. Had the New York Times not published WikiLeaks, it was all coming out anyway. WikiLeaks was going to publish it, Der Spiegel was going to publish it, The Guardian was going to publish it. So the New York Times added amplification to this, and I hope we added good, important interpretation and put it in the right context, but it's not as if this material was going to stay secret had we not engaged as publishers. The second thing was, I think there was really a great public service in publishing it, not only because it gave us a vision of American diplomacy, but because it gave many elsewhere in the world a vision of how they are perceived. There are many senior American diplomats who have said to me since that they believe that the Tunisia uprising, which of course was the start of all of this, was in part launched because the Tunisians read in WikiLeaks that the American embassy understood the depth of the corruption in their own country, as the country's president, and particularly his wife, sat by the pool eating caviar, drinking champagne, and people outside were making $2 a day. And they had known that they were run by a corrupt government, but to have it really laid out in specificity in the American cable that they read, I think certainly had an effect. It also had some deleterious effects. The American ambassador to Mexico was recently thrown out of the country by the Mexicans, and other ambassadors who've been asked to leave because they discovered how the Americans talked to them, about them. President Karzai in Afghanistan was not pleased to read the characterizations of him and his family in those tables. Nothing we hadn't published elsewhere in the newspaper, but it is different to read it in the words of those American diplomats. I think it'll take a few years before we really understand the full implications of what publishing it was. But I think we know immediately that the world has very much changed, that this old world in which you could expect the kind of pre-digital secrecy that takes place in the American government to continue is pretty much over. You know, at the moment that more than 500,000 people have security clearances for this kind of material, you have to expect it's going to get out. At the moment that information is wildly overclassified, my favorite in the WikiLeaks is from every embassy, every night, there would be summaries of the local press and what they were saying about events going on about the United States. And before they would send it to Washington, somebody would assemble all of these and stamp it secret, and then send it back to the State Department. These were things that were in the newspaper locally the day before. That tells you that something has gone awry in our own vision of this world. Well, I will leave it at that, and I look forward to our conversation. And again, I thank you for inviting me here tonight. It's great to be here.